Welcome, I'm John Caldera, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. A little later in the program, a look at the Colorado Ethics Commission and is it working? But first, I want to talk about national government and how do you change anything in Washington if you're just stuck here in the States and you can't get it through Congress? Well, to talk to us about that is Ken Clark with First Committee of Colorado, who's pushing an idea called the Article 5 Convention. We'll talk about that. And one of my dearest friends ever when he was in the legislature, John Super, good to have you back.
Thank you, John.
All right, now we argued over everything, mostly labor related.
Yes.
You loved my work at RTD.
And your work at RTD.
Yeah.
The fine work you did out in Thornton.
Fine work out in Thornton. No, don't blame me for that one. All right, there's a push to try to get something like the Taxpayer Bill of Rights into the federal government. There's also been a push to have what we have here in Colorado, term limits, into D.C. It wouldn't be nice to have Congress have term limits. They'll never vote for those things themselves. That takes away power from themselves. But the founders put together something that might help. What is it?
Well, Article 5 of the Constitution basically outlines two different ways that you can file an amendment to the Constitution. The first one, obviously, Congress can propose the amendments. The second one, the states have the ability to propose amendments to the Constitution as well. And let me give you a real quick background on how that works. The states make application to call a convention. If 34 states make an application to call a convention, Congress must call for the convention. Then all states are invited. Each state will pick its delegates to go to the convention. At the convention, they will hammer out a couple ideas, maybe one, maybe two, different ideas on a proposed amendment. If they do agree to the language of that amendment, then that amendment, it's necessary to have 38 states ratify that particular amendment. So you have to have 34 states call the convention, then 38 states ratify an amendment.
All right, let me kick that back to you, make sure I've got all this right. I remember in grade school, because Mrs. Ronaldo taught me very well, that the Constitution, the founders understood that things change over time and the document might need to change. And we've changed it now 28 times?
28 times.
Bill of Rights is 10 of them, so we change it very rarely, but it comes through Congress. Congress says we want this amendment, and then they pass it, and then the states have to ratify it, 38 of them. There's this other way, when the Congress is getting out of control, when D.C. is out of control, the states have a check and balance against the feds. We forget this, that the founders wanted a parity. They wanted balance because they knew as soon as something got out of balance, power would go off. This is a way to do that.
Yes, and it's important to remember that this is a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments. So the applications have to be in line, and the application will state, the application that the states make through their legislatures will state what the topics of the convention can address, and it is limited only to those topics. So for instance, if it's fiscal, we've got a $17.4 trillion debt, $105 trillion in unfunded mandates. D.C. will not fix itself. We, on the other hand, as the states, can fix that. Do we do a balanced budget amendment? Do we do a national debt relief amendment? And to give you an idea how powerful that is, we always have issues where we're talking about the debt ceiling, right? What would happen if we passed an amendment said if Washington, D.C. wants to raise the debt ceiling, 38 states have to approve it. That's power. That's the states taking away the power of the purse from Washington, D.C.
Let's bring it over here. In Colorado, we have the ability, we the rabble, we the citizens, have the ability to put things on the ballot. You served 8 years in the state legislature. You could have served more, but not as a state rep because we have term limits. Term limits never would have happened if not for the people taking control of the state legislature and putting some sort of limits on it. Do you see this as the same way, and is that a good idea?
I think that there's term limits on every election. If a person isn't doing their job, they should never be reelected. But do we get our electorate out there on board enough to say, I'm not going to leave that person in Congress for 40, 50 years just because they've been there before? I think that you need to have some form of way of getting them out. And I think term limits has its good points and its bad points. The good points is you stop that 40-year person from being there for 40 or 50 years. The bad thing is, maybe somebody is good. They get in there at a fairly young age and they haven't totally become senile. That's the reason it didn't bother me to get out of the legislature. When I got termed out, I was the oldest state rep. And I think that you need to have some young people in there, but you also have to have that institutional memory. And right now, the state of Colorado no longer has an institutional memory by the legislature. It's the lobbyists that have that institutional memory. And I think that you need to have a certain way of allowing that to happen. And one of the ways that it is now if they go from the House to the Senate, or like Senator Wiseman went from the Senate back down to the House, then you can get that institutional memory. But there's not many people that do that. And I think that our problem with some of these initiatives, you've tied the hands of the legislature by having so many citizen-initiated initiatives out there.
Would you be worried then if the states try to change the federal constitution the way that here in Colorado citizens have changed the state constitution? What's being proposed is that states get together and say, we need a change to the Constitution, maybe a balanced budget amendment, maybe something that addresses debt. Because they won't do it, we need to do it. Is that something that's a good idea or a bad idea?
I think it's a great idea. You've got to have that check and balance, but you've got to use it with wise decisions that you go out there. You don't need to do it for every little thing that comes down the line. Sometimes you'll run an initiative or an amendment that just really doesn't work out in the long run. It sounds good up front, but then it causes problems somewhere else down the line. And I think that we need to have the ability to do this. You need to have that check and balance, and I'm 100% behind it. And yes, I think that you had to do something with our budget. I have a real problem. The states can balance their budget, but the feds can't. We need to do something about that.
Let me bring up a fear that I keep hearing. Whenever there's a call for a convention, a lot of the Birch Society guys say, you can't have this because if you have a constitutional convention, then they're going to take away our guns, they're going to take away the Bill of Rights, they're going to do all sorts of things and destroy the Constitution. We don't want to rebuild the Constitution. But I hear you using very specific words. I haven't heard you say constitutional convention. What's the difference?
Well, the idea is that this is not a constitutional convention. There's only been one of those. This is a convention of states. There have been in excess of 33 different conventions of states in our history. Not one of them turned into a quote-unquote con-con. That is a myth. That is, I like to refer to it as a lie.
Well, you just used a number.
Can't happen.
How many times have we had a convention of the states?
Conventions of the states have happened 33 times in our history.
And when was the latest?
The last one was in the early 1900s, and there were 7 states that got together and held a convention that had to do with water rights, and that was in the early 1900s.
And if they wanted to propose an amendment to the federal Constitution, they could have. They didn't have enough, but if they had enough states, they could have done so.
Well, they could have, but then they would have had to rally 2/3 of the existing states to get behind that and call a convention to do that. Article 5 is very specific. You have to have 2/3 of the states make application for a convention of the states specifically for the purpose of proposing amendments. There is no way that they can rewrite the Constitution. That cannot happen. The application itself dictates what the topics in the convention itself will be considered. That's it. And if they go outside of that, it's illegal. It can't happen. So let's, for instance, take a look at the applications that are being proposed now. They're mostly fiscal. So you can do a BBA, a balanced budget amendment. You can do an NDRA, which is a national debt relief amendment. Those are the types of things that can be included. If you broaden that application a little bit, then you can talk about judicial review. You can talk about term limits, things of that nature. It's very powerful, but it's also very limited. The idea of a quote-unquote runaway convention, that's a 237-year-old myth. The original Constitutional Convention was not a runaway convention. It was there to rewrite the Articles of Confederation, and it was perfectly legal. Then the states have conventions within them to ratify the amendment, and that is simply a thumbs up or thumbs down. That's it. So if 38 states don't ratify it, the amendment does not pass.
All right, you've been at this at the state level. You've seen that if you've seen 100 legislators fight over the most ridiculous crap. And now you've got a little perspective. You've been out of office. Tell me, could Colorado or other state legislators actually get together and say, we want to make an application. We think that the debt, let's say, or taxes or fiscal policies getting so bad, we want to get enough states to call this convention of the states so that we can propose an amendment. Do you think state legislators even understand they have that power?
I think they could understand it. Whether they have the will to do it, I don't know. The whole time I was down there, I was on local government a lot. I believe in local control. You know, the state shouldn't tell the counties what they have to do, or self-ruled cities what they have to do. You need that local control, and I think the states need to have state control to a certain point, where one state can't go in there and tell the rest of the United States what they have to do. And the way this is written, the way I understand it, one state couldn't do it by itself. It takes a bunch of states to do it. You have to have a two-thirds majority of the states to ratify it. Some places it says three-quarters, 75%. And I think that, yes, you need to have this ability, but you got to use it very wisely. And certain things need to be done. I think that Washington is terribly broken. I think our state has its problems, and I've made no secret that money controls politics. Until we get money out of politics, I don't see how we can do anything.
Well, the states have lost power to the federal government. Ever since FDR, we've seen that the growth of D.C.'s power over the states. You know, we can't make our own roads without it. We can't even have our own drunk driving laws now. We don't have control over Colorado. I don't think legislators understand that they have the ability, with other states around the country, to pull together a convention to address any one of these issues, because it hasn't been done in 100 years.
Well, it was done right before the Civil War. The states got together, passed an amendment to abolish slavery, and that was through Article 5. And back in the mid-'80s, the states got together, 32 states passed a resolution to call a convention of the states, and they were working on a balanced budget amendment. But then Congress, in a panic mode, gave us Grand Redmond. And so the convention of the states kind of fizzled out and died. But right now we have north of 20 states that have already have resolutions on the books.
What about Colorado?
Colorado has one. It's already been passed, and it goes back to the late 1800s, but it is still valid. I do have it on good authority.
Wait, the 1800s. So
late 1800s.
Colorado wants to do a balanced budget or fiscal meeting of the states from the 1800s?
It's still valid. Now, wait a minute. Let me correct that. I don't think Colorado's is that old, but we do have one that is on file.
If I remember correctly, something in the 80s,
that's accurate. Yes.
We passed something, the state legislature passed, saying we call on D.C. to do something about a balanced budget, and we'd like to see a convention of the states to address that issue.
That is accurate.
We're one of about 27.
There are other states that the resolutions they have on file do go back over 100 years, and those are still valid now. We are going to drop another resolution during the 2014 session. I think it'll happen next week. And in order to try to get Colorado to be one of these states that has said, yes, we want a convention of the states for the purpose of proposing amendments to rein in the federal government. D.C. is not going to fix itself. We have to do it for them. We have to do it to them. However you want to look at it, the states have to pull that power away from Washington, D.C.
Real quickly, is this a doable thing?
I think it's a doable thing. One thing about the balanced budget, when we go into debt, it's usually during the time of war, and it made sense. Sometimes you had to borrow money in order to fund the war. And I think it just got out of control where they never ever wanted to get rid of it. So
don't worry, we got kids. They'll take care of it all. Yeah. That's their problem. It's not my problem.
I got kids and great grandkids, and I don't want to burden them.
Representative, thank you. Ken, thank you. Stay tuned. You're going to like this.